Russian troops have reportedly taken full control of the area around the Chernobyl nuclear power station, including the plant itself. That site just about 60 miles from Kyiv. These are live pictures from Kyiv Thursday morning. You could actually hear the shelling there in this video when our photographer captured these scenes there under the lights. Joining us now with the very latest is ABC's Phil Lipoff. He's actually in Poland. We also have with us White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks and ABC News' Elizabeth Schulze also. But first, let's start with Ian Pannell, who is in Kyiv after just listening to the president speak. Ian, can you just bring us up to date on what you are seeing, hearing, and what you know right now there straight from Kyiv?
Yeah, hi there, Kira. I mean, interestingly, the video that you were talking about there was shot by my cameraman here, James Gillings, and that really was the mood here. Suddenly we went from Vladimir Putin speaking to the sound of explosions ringing out across the capital, Kiev, and it's been an increasingly tense day. We have seen Russian forces start to move in from three distinct directions, really, in the northeast, up on the eastern border to near Russia, around Kharkiv. Heavy fighting taking place there. We've seen fighting to the south, just over the Crimean Peninsula. This was a peninsula that was annexed by Russian forces back in 2014. Fighting taking place there. But I think most worrying for the capital, Kyiv, is this fighting that's been taking place at the Antonov airfield, which is only about 20 miles in that direction. We were seeing explosions in that direction last night. Not possible to say whether it was at that airfield, but we know that Russian special forces landed. There were videos of helicopters flying into that area. They were engaged by Ukrainian forces. It now appears that the airfield has been secured by those Russian troops. Russian troops also moving into Chernobyl. Of course, people will know Chernobyl from the nuclear disaster that happened there in the 1980s, but there is a protected area there. Russian troops have moved in and seem to control that. What that means is that Russian forces are now about 65 miles or so outside of Kiev, up by Chernobyl. But most worryingly, this airfield here is only 20 miles away from the center of the city. What this looks like is an attempt to effectively decapitate the Ukrainian military, render it ineffective, but also to take on the Ukrainian government in an effort to potentially try and encircle the capital. We've seen hundreds, potentially thousands of people leave Kiev today, heading westwards. Also people coming from the east of the country in this direction. Things have changed dramatically in 24 hours, and the situation tonight in the capital looks increasingly desperate.
So, Ian, with those that have not been able to leave, what more can you tell us about this major curfew that has been imposed? Also, we are reading that the metro stations there are turning into bomb shelters. Can you give us more for a feel of what Ukrainians are going through there in Kyiv that have not been able to leave?
Yeah, and that is the vast majority. It's a good question. The streets have been eerily quiet today. Most of the shops, most of the stores have been closed. The supermarkets that were open had lines of people going in there, stocking up on supplies. This is something that we hadn't seen in the previous few weeks, despite all the warnings. ATM machines had long lines of people. As you say, some of the metro stations, which are very deep underground, were being used as bomb shelters. But I think this is a very terrifying and lonely time for a lot of Ukrainians. We just met up with a woman called Mariska Podolko. She's a famous morning news anchor here in Ukraine. We'd interviewed with her for ABC News a few weeks back. We'd stayed in contact with her. Her husband, who's a former MP, had signed up with the civilian defense forces. We saw him in training. He didn't even have a real gun at that point, just a wooden silhouette of a gun. Well, today, he's now gone effectively to the army. He's left his wife. Their children have been dropped off at a hotel on their own in western Ukraine for their own safety, while she tries to get her elderly parents together and decides what to do. She sat in a flat just with her cat, alone and afraid and not knowing what to do. They all believed they'd have more time. They all believed that this would never happen. Nobody could have imagined quite how devastating a moment this would be for the country and for the individuals. And that's what everyone's having to go through right now. It's hard to comprehend. You know, the Ukrainians are like us. us. They live their lives in a very similar way. They have similar aspirations, and they, like us, would never have imagined that such a day would come to pass. And yet that is the reality. It's a very lonely prospect. Yes, the rest of the world may condemn what's happening, but they know that this fight is theirs and theirs alone.
It is quite a tale of two countries. Ian Panel there in Kyiv for us with a feel for how the people, the Ukrainians, are responding to this invasion. From there, we go to Moscow, where our James Longman is there on the streets. He, too, has had a chance to talk to the people there. James, I understand you've been a part of witnessing protests. Tell us what the response has been, not only to the President of the United States and his speech that he gave just moments ago, but what things have been like since we talked yesterday.
Well, we heard that there were protests down on the street here in central Moscow, and we felt we had to come down and see. There were hundreds of people actually on the street. It's calmed down a bit now, but you can see this is the response you get in Vladimir Putin's Russia if you decide to come out and protest the decision he's made. Riot police, these are the men in blue here, and they have been steadily picking people off the street, arresting them. I was listening to President Biden's comments there. Whilst he was speaking, 3 or 4 people were arrested at the time. One was just stood next to me, not doing anything at all, picked off the street, taken away. That is what happens here. Now, there haven't been protests like this really since the arrest of Alexei Navalny over a year ago, and so it really is quite something to watch people come down into the street here. They are mostly young people. I had 2 young girls, actually. There's 2 students who ran up to us, literally. She said to me, "What news organisation are you from?" I said, "ABC News." She said, "ABC News, really? Let me speak to you." I've never had that before, and it was absolutely extraordinary because she felt so overwhelmed that she had the chance to say how she felt about something, and she said that Vladimir Putin does not represent her, and she felt very strongly that she wanted to make that known. But there's a sense really among young people here that they don't really have a leadership for their opposition here, because obviously in Vladimir Putin's Russia, you are arrested and imprisoned if you show that you disagree with him or if you show any opposition to him. So really it's an opposition movement which is leaderless. But they came down here, they said they were chanting no to war, and they wanted to have their feelings heard. And I spoke to another woman who was very moving. I said, "What do you want to say to the people of Ukraine?" And she looked at the camera and she just said, "We're praying for your women and children." Because there is a realization among a certain quarter of Russian society that what Vladimir Putin has done is awful as far as they're concerned. I should say that this is not the majority necessarily in Russia. There are many different Russias. We're in Moscow, cosmopolitan city. There will be many Russians across the country who do believe in what Vladimir Putin has been saying, and that's for one very clear reason, which is that it's a very heavily controlled media space here. We had an announcement yesterday by the kind of media watchdog, it's essentially a censorship agency, telling media outlets here that they must use, quote-unquote, official Russian sources to report on the news from Ukraine. And if they don't, they get fined. $80,000 is the fine, because they're talking about this as being a military operation. They won't use the word invasion. You won't see that word used on any Russian state media, because they have to walk a very fine line. Ukraine is not some distant foreign nation. They are brothers and sisters to Russian people. They are, in many cases, cousins. They're relations. They share a shared history, a shared culture. And Vladimir Putin knows that. So they've been very, very clear about the narrative here. This is not about attacking civilians. They've said that. They said it's only about hitting military installations, and it certainly isn't an invasion. Now, people here in Russia will be left to kind of come to their own conclusions about that. But certainly these young people on the street here in Moscow, they don't believe a word of it. Kira?
James Longman in Moscow. James, thank you so much. Appreciate your perspective. So from Ukraine to Russia to now here in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., where we heard President Biden today outline these strong sanctions and economic consequences that Russia will now face because of Putin's choice to invade. Take a listen from his speech moments ago.
Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It'll strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It'll degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It'll hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions.
Mary Ellis, you look at James Longman standing on the streets of Moscow where life looks so normal behind him. And then you listen to what President Biden just outlined and these actions he has taken, these sanctions, and you wonder how quickly Russians will feel the impact of these sanctions, not only short term, but long term.
Yeah, Kira, President Biden said that these sanctions were designed to have an immediate impact as well as an impact over time. He laid out that the United States would be sanctioning 4 major banks in Russia, over $1 trillion in assets. He said every asset they have here in America will be frozen. But you're exactly right. There's a reason that President Biden faced incredible skepticism from reporters in the room who were asking, is it enough and how long will it take? I was very struck by the moment where President Biden said, come back to me in 30 days. In a month, he said, a month, ask me what effect these sanctions are having. Well, it's hard to imagine that anyone in Ukraine wants to wait a month for things to have an impact. I think that the United States, President Biden, the White House is going to be under a lot of pressure to pull out all the stops. We've already heard that from members of Congress. You know, Leader McConnell today said that they need to have the most punishing sanctions available to them put in place right now. The White House is still facing a lot of questions as to why President Putin himself wasn't singled out and sanctioned individually. I think that they're going to continue to get that question, and they just right now don't have a good answer for it.
Well, the president also touting that NATO has never been more unified at this point, which takes us to Phil Lipoff there in Poland, where U.S. troops are helping at border checkpoints. What role are they playing at this point? What challenges are they facing as they do get ready, Phil, for possibly hundreds of thousands of refugees?
Well, Kira, it's already kind of begun. Our Matt Gutman was at the border today and reported that there is a family he spoke to that had been waiting in line 11 hours to get from Ukraine into Poland. And he said that line is going to get longer, up to 20 hours. And then who knows from there, because this is the worst case scenario in Ukraine. There are Ukrainians now needing to flee to Poland for help and for safety for their families. And as you mentioned, we have thousands of troops here, the 82nd Airborne Division. They are down on the border, and they are doing everything they can with Polish authorities trying to set up the border. There are 8 border crossings. If you look at the map, most of Poland's border is shared with Ukraine. Tiny portion of it up north with Russia, but that's not really in question right now. It's the stretch of the border where there are 8 border crossings where people are going to be coming over. There are many Ukrainians already living here in Lublin, where I am, and I spoke to many of them today. And Mary Alice makes a good point. The reporters in that room with President Biden were asking the question, the Ukrainians here in Poland asking the same question. Are sanctions enough? Why haven't you gone after Vladimir Putin himself? You put sanctions on time and time again, and look, he's taking Ukraine as we speak. And the Ukrainians who live there have family across the border in Ukraine, and they are desperately worried about them. I spoke with one young family who, just by fortune, came here last night to Lublin from Ukraine, from Lviv actually, to sleep here for the night because they were so concerned. They have a 1-year-old son, and so they thought they would spend the night here and then go back tomorrow, or today rather, and that is not the case. They now wake up today and say, maybe it'll be a day, maybe it'll be weeks, and then they see the further incursion and the surrounding of these cities in Ukraine, and they just don't know when they're going to go back here.
And Elizabeth, what are you hearing from the Pentagon and the White House about the potential for this war in Ukraine to spread to other NATO allies? And are U.S. troops preparing for that? I mean, the president did just say if Putin moves into NATO countries, we will be involved.
Yeah, that's right, Kira. The president has made a very clear point to say that there will be no U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. But if this invasion spreads to NATO countries, that's a different story. We are getting a statement from a senior defense official who tells us that at the direction of the president, Defense Secretary Austin has now ordered the deployment of 7,000 additional troops from the U.S. to Germany. This is part of those 8,500 troops that have been placed on high alert. So this is a new set of troops that are now going to be sent to Europe, in addition addition to the existing ones that have been kind of reallocated to the eastern flank. So part of an effort to really shore up the NATO response there, which really has been the military message that President Biden has made in these public addresses, saying we are standing by our allies, that NATO has now activated its activation response plans, and that this is a very clear, coordinated effort that we are ready to accelerate if needed, but really still making that point that this is about shoring up the NATO presence versus bringing any American troops into the conflict in Ukraine right now.
Elizabeth, Mary Alice, James, Ian, Phil, all of you, thank you so much as we continue to follow all the latest on Russia and Ukraine.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.